Colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism all rely on race based hierarchies of domination. Our video essay will follow their intertwinement and evolution in America. To understand racial hierarchy in America, we have to begin before America itself. European colonialism did not simply discover new lands, it created a religious, political, and racial logic for domination. The doctrine of discovery gave Christian European powers the supposed right to claim indigenous lands, convert native peoples, and organize the world around European superiority. This was not just conquest. Conquest made moral, legal, and sacred. In Germania, Tacitus described Germanic peoples as pure, strong, and distinct from others. Centuries later, European thinkers would reuse these ideas to construct myths of racial purity and superiority. Whiteness was built as a political identity, strengthened through empire, colonial expansion, and the need to justify domination over indigenous peoples and colonized lands. In America, our argument truly begins with slavery. The 1619 Project helps us see that American democracy, capitalism, and racial slavery developed together. Enslaved Africans were not simply excluded from American freedom. Their labor helped build the wealth that made American freedom possible for others. The plantation was not outside capitalism, it was one of its foundations.
This is the central point. American capitalism was not accidentally racist. Instead, it was built through racism. The plantation turned black bodies into labor, labor into commodities, and commodities into wealth. Cotton, sugar, tobacco, land, banks, insurance companies, and shipping industries all grew through the extraction of enslaved labor. One example, among many others, is Eli Whitney's cotton gin machine, for which a patent is shown here. Inventions like these are proof that slavery was a calculated economic engine. Race became the technology that made this exploitation appear natural. Racism told the story that black people were fit for bondage, while capitalism collected the profits of that lie. This is where whiteness became more than identity. It became property, status, and protection. Poor white laborers did not have the wealth of plantation owners, but they were offered racial superiority as compensation. Whiteness gave them legal rights, social power, and a sense of belonging above enslaved black people. One example, shown here, is that during slavery, poor white men who did not own land were frequently employed as overseers. In this way, race divided labor and protected the ruling class. It made exploitation easier by convincing poor whites that their real interest was not solidarity with black workers, but loyalty to whiteness. After the Civil War, slavery was abolished, but the racial hierarchy that slavery created did not disappear. It adapted. This is what scholar Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. Hartman argues that slavery continues to shape the present through skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. In other words, slavery did not simply end and vanish. Its violence was reorganized into the conditions of everyday life. This idea is essential because it shows that racism is not only an attitude and slavery is not only a past event. The afterlife of slavery is visible when black communities are denied equal schools, equal healthcare, and as this government redlining map shows, equal housing and equal wealth. The descendants of enslaved people inherit poverty, while the descendants of enslavers inherit land, capital, and institutional power. Capitalism survives by pretending that the market is neutral while ignoring the racial death that created the market in the first place.
Ida B. Wells exposes this same continuity in Southern Horrors. Wells shows that white supremacy survived abolition by embedding itself within American institutions through Jim Crow laws and lynch violence. Lynching was not a random mob violence, it was political and economic terror. It punished black people who challenged white power, especially those who gained land, businesses, education, or political influence. Wells reveals that racial violence functioned as a tool of economic control. The end of slavery created the possibility of black freedom, but white institutions responding by creating new systems of domination. Jim Crow restricted black citizenship, lynching enforced fear, sharecropping trapped black families in cycles of debt. Together, these systems maintained white control over labor, land, and political power. In other words, the racial order survived because it evolved. Malcolm X makes a similar argument in Message to the Grassroots. He argues that the economic logic of slavery did not end, it changed form. Through his metaphor of the house Negro and the field Negro, Malcolm X critiques the ways systems of power create dependence and loyalty within oppressed populations. The house Negro identifies with the master because he is closer to power, while the field Negro sees the system more clearly because he experienced its violence directly. For Malcolm X, this was not just about the past, it was a critique of integration under white control. He argued that much of the white political establishment supported civil rights only when it could manage, limit, or absorb the movement. In his view, legal equality did not necessarily mean liberation. If black people were integrated into institutions still controlled by white wealth and white politics, then the foundation of racial capitalism remained untouched. Scholar Cedric Robinson gave this a name. In his 1983 book, Black Marxism, Robinson developed the concept of racial capitalism, the argument that there is no such thing as non-racial capitalism. Robinson challenged the idea that capitalism broke cleanly from the feudal world and that racism was simply a tool capitalism picked up along the way. Instead, he argued that capitalism emerged inside a Western civilization already organized by racial hierarchy, one that has been sorting and ranking human beings along racial lines long before the first plantation was built. Racialism, he wrote, was a material force that had already saturated European feudal society. And so, when capitalism rose, it did not create race from scratch. It inherited race, institutionalized it, and made it profitable on a global scale. This is why Robinson insisted that capitalism can only accumulate by moving through severe inequality among human groups. It requires the devaluation of certain lives in order to function. The plantation, the slave ship, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration are not exceptions to capitalism. They are expressions of it. Robinson calls this the black radical tradition, the long history of resistance by people who understood from the bottom of the system exactly how that system worked.
Derek Bell takes this argument even further in Space Traders. Through a dystopian story, Bell presents the theory of racial realism, the idea that racism is not an accidental flaw in American society, but a permanent feature embedded in its legal, political, and economic systems. In this story, America is offered wealth, technology, and national salvation in exchange for surrendering black citizens to aliens. The horror of the story is not just the trade itself. The horror is that the trade becomes politically imaginable. Bell suggests that when profit, national interest, and white comfort are placed against black humanity, American institutions have repeatedly chosen profit and power. His story forces us to ask whether America's commitment to equality is real, or whether equality is only defended when it does not threaten the structure of white dominance. This history is not trapped in the past. Today, racial hierarchy persists through economic inequality, ecological injustice, and especially mass incarceration. The prison system has become one of the clearest examples of racial control after slavery and Jim Crow. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime, creating a loophole through which forced labor and racial punishment could continue. Over time, black Americans were criminalized through policing, segregation, drug laws, and prison labor. Mass incarceration is the afterlife of slavery in its most visible modern form. The language changes from slave to criminal. The justification changes from racial biology to law and order. But the effect is similar. Black communities are controlled, exploited, and politically weakened. When people are incarcerated, they lose wages, family stability, voting rights, educational opportunity, and social mobility. The prison becomes not just a place of punishment, but a machine that reproduces racial and economic inequality.
And capitalism benefits from this. Prisons create jobs in the rural economy, contracts for private companies, cheap labor for corporations, and political power for those who promise to carry out punishment rather than attempt rehabilitation. The carceral system thereby makes poverty a characteristic worthy of criminalization, encouraging immediate profit through measures like over-policing. Mass incarceration is thus deeply entrenched in both capitalism and racism, an effective intersection where both systems of injustice meet. Ecological injustice follows the same pattern. Communities of color are more likely to live near pollution, industrial waste, and other environmental hazards. This is not accidental. It reflects a long history of deciding whose lives, neighborhoods, and bodies are considered disposable. The same racial logic that justified slavery and segregation now appears in toxic air, unsafe water, underfunded schools, and unequal access to healthcare. So, the story of American racial hierarchy is not a story of one system ending and another beginning. It is a story of transformation. Colonialism established the logic of domination, and slavery reformed this logic into an economic engine. Even after the abolition of slavery, this systemic injustice was preserved by Jim Crow laws, and though later challenged by the civil rights movement, its economic foundations were not fully dismantled. Today, mass incarceration, inequality, and environmental racism continue to reveal how deeply racial hierarchy is built into American life. Whiteness, then, is not merely a skin color. It is a historical structure of power, created to justify conquest, protect property, divide labor, and preserve hierarchy. Capitalism in America was built on this structure. It required stolen land, stolen labor, racial classification, and organized violence. To mitigate racism, we must not only challenge prejudice in individual hearts, rather, we must challenge the institutions that continue to make racial domination profitable, legal, and effectively normalized. The central question is then not whether America has changed. It has. The question becomes how we can identify the contemporary racial hierarchy and how it has persisted in new forms, remaining invisible until we scratch the surface. If slavery's afterlife still appears in poverty, incarceration, premature death, ecological harm, and unequal opportunity, then racism is not just part of American history. It is part of the economic design America has inherited and still refuses to fully dismantle.